Okay, let's go for it.
Okay. All right. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3, 4, 5. Up. Looks like we are up.
Let's go for it.
Okay. All right, and we're audible too. Excellent. Okay, Nathan, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Do we have are we supposed to be on camera?
We
I don't
are
think we
streaming. Yeah, we are on camera and streaming. If you check your, there'll be a short delay, but if you check your computer, you will see that we are audible and visible. So, hooray.
Sounds good. People will see. Your background is much more impressive than mine. I just have a white wall. Um, you have,
A trophy case. Yeah, I
books,
mean,
trophies.
yeah, you're the kind of person I beat up in high school, I'm sure, Nathan. I'm just kidding. Not so much, yeah. So, how is the weather in England right now?
It's not bad. There's like a 3-day period when the weather is kind of transitioning from cold to hot, where it's not so bad. So,
Yeah, I was there. I was mostly in England for my first year of my PhD. I'm in LSE in history, in international history, and I'm now going back and forth from the States and also doing some overseas research projects in the archive. So, and you're at Cambridge right now, correct?
yep, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, Nathan. So I got some questions. I'll try to talk about them in a colloquial fashion. Just to be a brief introduction, we're happy to have Nathan Cofnas today, philosopher, controversial, public intellectual, we could say, on what I hope to be the first of, well, actually second because of Norman Finkelstein, second of many more History Speaks interviews. And we're live streaming today, and we actually managed to do it after, felt like pulling teeth, but we managed to get online. So that's great. Nathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good
Yeah,
to
I
be
don't know
here.
why us. I invented us, but it's just me. Uh, anyway, so give us a really simple background. How old are you? How did you get into philosophy? Why did you become a philosopher? Um, why specifically ethics? And what areas regarding ethics do you work in and do you wish to work in the future?
Well, I'm 35 years old. When I went to, I first became interested in some of these issues concerning evolution and human psychology. I assumed originally that I was going to major in something like psychology, but um, when I took some psychology and philosophy classes, uh, I, uh, I felt that although I was interested in a lot of the material in the psychology courses and also in anthropology. One of my mentors when I was an undergraduate was an anthropologist, which is the person I first learned about race differences and also Kevin MacDonald from, although he didn't endorse MacDonald, but he made me aware of his work. Um, but I was interested in a lot of the big picture questions and also the areas of science that I was interested that I had the most interest were uh, areas where there's uh, fundamental disagreement about methodology, the nature of the evidence, and how to interpret the evidence rather than kind of more uh, normal science kind of areas. So philosophy was a better fit. And I was always interested in ethics, just as the phenomenon that people think there are these rules that we need to follow. Um, why do we think that? Where do they come from? So I'm interested in my interest in morality is um, split between the psychological and the philosophical. So psychologically, how do we acquire these beliefs? um, what what exactly is the nature of moral cognition, and then the philosophical question of what are the implications of this? Is there any objective reality to morality? And as a philosopher, I'm able to explore all of these things. You have much more freedom as a
Hmm.
philosopher to cross boundaries, and that's why I publish about half my papers are published in science journals, half
Hmm.
in
Interesting.
philosophy journals, which I wouldn't be
Yeah.
able to do as a scientist.
Interesting. So I have a bone to pick with you on the race stuff, which we'll get into maybe in 5, 10 minutes. But first, um, to unpack a bit your views on ethics. So, my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and I was much more interested in metaphysics and epistemology than I was ethics, because I guess I just didn't really understand how, short of the invocation of like a omniscient being, how ethics could have any objective content. I guess I sort of accepted, even though I'm not like a logical positivist in general, I recognize like the problems with it, like with a priori truths and so on. But like the existence of those. But it just I guess the argument of someone like even like AJ Ayer in Language, Truth, and Meaning, or whatever it was called, like about there's no verifiability of to ethical principles. You can't verify or falsify them, and you also can't like derive them. It seems to me in a legitimate a priori way, like you can with mathematical truths, right? Um, so it just seems to me like kind of arbitrary navel gazing, but it could be my lack of reading on the subject. But what do you think of that? Are you how would you characterize your meta ethics views, like moral realism? What is moral realism? How, is there like ethical substance existing outside of us? It doesn't seem to make sense to me. But give me your
Well, the only thing you said that I would disagree with, well, is that it's difficult to dismiss if you make you, so the moral realist will make a comparison between mathematics and ethics. So mathematics also is something that isn't you
Mhm,
can't interact with
mhm,
numbers in the same
right.
way that you
It's
can
not
with
empiric. Mathematical
physical
proofs are
physical objects.
not generally regarded as empirical.
So they would say that that just as we can be justified in believing mathematical statements about mathematics, we could be justified in believing ethical truths. But of course, ethics is, I mean, some people just come to the correct conclusion very quickly, and there's no real reason to study it beyond that, which is that, yeah, the whole thing makes no sense. The idea of objectively mind independent morality, um, unless you define morality, you stipulate some definition where it does make sense, um, or you say that by morality you mean that it promotes cooperation or something, and there are truths about what promotes cooperation that are objective. Okay, but uh, the the theory that there's something beyond that, that there's some reality to ethics that exists independently of our thoughts or beliefs, feelings, conventions. Uh, yeah, that I think doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But
Okay. So, but what is the difference between? So, okay, I'm glad you make that concession. So we're on the same planet at least. But what is the difference
it's
between an
not a concession. This is a
no,
central
no, no. I'm not sorry.
component
That
of
was
that. Yeah.
I'm thinking in terms of stupid like internet debate nonsense. Like so, I'm using dumb words like that. But recognition, let's say you make that. I'm glad we agree on that view. Because that means we're on the same planet. But is there a principal difference between like moral subjectivism and moral relativism on the one hand, and like moral anti-realism on the other hand, though? Maybe that's something that I could be more receptive to. That like, what exactly is the difference between moral anti-realism and like emotivism, the view of AJ era, subjectivism, etc.
Well, I mean, the problem with error is the verifiability criterion
Yeah,
of
right,
meaning, which has a lot of problems,
right,
even
yeah,
for science. And
right.
so there's no reason to. I don't think it would be a strong critique of ethics to say that it fails according to the verifiability criterion of meaning, because
Mhm.
everything fails according to that. Um,
Fair enough. Yeah.
but the problem with ethics, uh, basically, okay, the fact that we believe something just the mere fact that you believe it is, you can say that there's prima facie justification for believing it. You have a feeling or an intuition that X is true, so now you have to give a reason why you should give up X. Well, in ethics, we have a very good explanation for why we hold ethical beliefs, which doesn't invoke or doesn't depend on those beliefs being true. So these are so-called debunking arguments. So if I show that your belief that X is the result of some causal process that doesn't track the truth about X, then that undermines any justification that you have for believing X. You have this intuition that X is true, but I showed you, I can explain the process that caused you to hold that belief, and that process has nothing to do with, even if X is true or false, it has nothing to do with X.
Right.
So there's no reason for you to take that intuition seriously. Now, with ethics, if I show you that your beliefs about fairness and being nice to people is the product of evolution by natural selection, then that would debunk the ethical beliefs. That would mean there's no reason to take the belief seriously, because natural selection doesn't track moral truth, even if moral truth existed. Natural selection only cares about inclusive fitness.
Right.
So if natural selection, which only cares about inclusive fitness, explains why you have certain moral intuitions, then we should give up our belief that the intuitions correspond to any objective reality.
Yeah.
I should say that I actually don't think natural selection explains our moral intuitions in the way that other philosophers do. But that's kind of
interesting.
A long story. I think there's another debunking explanation. So
interesting.
Debunk.
It sounds like our positions on meta-ethics, like my kind of more crass undergraduate philosophy position, your more considered position, there's not that much. There's some commonality. Like you agree that the idea of mind-independent ethical truths, like stuff existing out there, that is the ethics, is a non-starter. It's just conceptually bizarre.
Yeah, it's a non-starter. So we just I take a more roundabout way to get there, but that's the conclusion. So if somebody isn't tempted by the realist position, then I would necessarily recommend studying this issue in great detail.
The philosophers, I have to say, I read a survey of philosophers that made me cringe because I think that the majority or plurality were moral realists, and I thought that's just an absurd position.
So these terms are used somewhat inconsistently.
Okay. Oh, sure, yeah.
So some people call themselves anti-realists, but then hold positions that others would call realist positions. So on that survey, I know the one, it was with David Chalmers and somebody else, I think is what you're referring to. Like a lot of philosophers called themselves naturalists, meaning that the ethic principles, truth is identifiable, can be equated with some natural property. But then on certain interpretations, this could be kind of anti-realist. They just mean morality is used, the word morality is used in a certain way.
Nathan, I'm going to tell you to entertain our viewers for 30 seconds because I have to tweet this out. I forgot to do so. I did tweet it last night, and the guys should still be, and the ladies, if they're working for Veronica, I hope they are, would still be in the link, but I'm going to have to tweet this out again just to say, hey, we are live. So say something entertaining while I do that.
Well, I could talk more about metaethics, but that's the least entertaining thing.
Well, I mean, people are interested. We got an odd audience, so.
Well, there are a lot of smart people who get tripped up on this issue. I think the most notorious example is Sam Harris, who has
Hmm.
a
Yeah,
very
the thing about Sam Harris is it doesn't seem like he's willing to engage the meta ethics. He just seems to say utilitarianism is right while not conceding he's making an assumption, foundational meta ethical assumption. And it's kind of frustrating to read. Like I read The Moral Landscape back in college, and I remember being frustrated with his lack of engagement on like the meta ethics stuff. But go ahead.
well, a lot of rationalists and reason and science types think that yeah, utilitarianism is just based on pure logic, and
Hmm.
everything else is a distortion of the pure logic of
Hmm.
utilitarianism. Uh, without thinking, but what they're really doing is they're just taking one moral intuition among many moral intuitions that we have, and just declaring that that is the only one that they care about, and then it's appealing to them because they can kind of have a fantasy about a unit of pleasure and a unit of pain that can be some added and then compared with each other. And even that doesn't make much sense if you actually think about it. Like, how do you compare uh, one? What is one unit of pleasure or one unit of pain? Um,
Well, I have to say,
but
I'm more intuitively, I understand that is also conceptually rather quite awkward and counterintuitive, but I think we can make statements that imply some kind of qualitative, some kind of um, you know, quantitative difference between suffering, let's say. So like if you stub your toe and somebody comes in here, like some neo-Nazi who's mad at me for attacking Holocaust deniers, comes in here and chops my finger off, I think we can say that my suffering is like more than twice as much as yours.
yeah,
Whereas you'd say
sure.
that's yeah.
I mean, we these are a kind of judgment that we
Hmm.
make, but it's not. Uh, there's a kind of false uh, aura of precision in some of these discussions,
Sure.
and there are a lot of and utilitarianism generates like very obvious paradoxes, which most people just don't accept. Even when they say that they're utilitarians, they come up with some way to weasel out of accepting these consequences. Like if there's a person who just is able to experience so much pleasure, then
All
that's
right,
the
like the
only thing.
nose
And he
experience machine or
the
no, no, sorry, his
the
utility
utility
monster.
monster, yeah.
Yeah.
So utility monster, or we should torture one person for fun if there are enough
Yeah.
people,
Or
enough
if there's
sadists
or
get
if it's
pleasure.
impossible, if there's one person that had this hypothetical ability to like peep on women or men, I guess, too, and never get caught, then that's not immoral under the utilitarian conception, right?
So and the only reason
Yeah.
utilitarianism is appealing in the first place is because intuitively it sounds good, but then
Mhm.
there are all these consequences that intuitively are bad. So if it's your intuition that is the arbiter of this, then you know if it has these intuitively unacceptable conclusions, and you should just reject it. But there's no reason. You know, ideally, we should just have the true belief, which is that morality is just all in our minds. And now it serves a function, and we can kind of go along with these rules for practical reasons. But treating ethics as being like a science where we make
Yeah.
discoveries and there's a truth of the matter and there are kind of a moral mathematics, I think that's all a fantasy.
Do you think that, and then I want to shift to more controversial territory, but this is interesting to me, so I'll burrow a little deeper. Do you think that this is speculative, but there's incentive here? Do you think that ethicists and philosophers who study ethics have an incentive to try to claim there's more objectivity to their fields than there is, just so they can keep writing their essays and so on? Because if they took moral relativist position, there wouldn't be that much to do, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a huge part of the story, is the sociological fact that if you admit this, then you kind of give up on
Yeah.
what you're doing. And I'm not saying that the moral realists aren't sincere, but uh, you have people who are attracted to philosophy, disproportionately people who kind of like reasoning based on intuition, um, which is why they go into philosophy rather than an empirical field. So they're already kind of more disposed than average to the idea of moral realism, which is you have access to these deep truths just based on your intuitions. And then the people within ethics, for if you if you realize that it's all just in our minds, and it's all just a psychological, sociological question and not really a philosophical one, then you're probably just going to drop out of the field. And then everyone who's left will be, or most of the people who are left are going to be moral realists. And then it looks like there's, all this support for moral realism because
Mhm.
because all the professional meta-ethicists
I've gone to,
are, yeah.
yeah, and all the people who are interested in a more objective framework have gone to epistemology or metaphysics or whatever, or to science.
Yeah, anything but meta-ethics.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fair. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you a little more pointed questions about your biography. So you've been in some level of trouble because of views, not because of anything you've done in terms of academic misconduct or anything like that, but because of views you've expressed on race and arguments that race could be linked to intelligence in some kind of biological sense. So I completely defend your freedom of inquiry. I would stand up with you and sign any petition if people were trying to vilify you. I think it's absurd. You can't go after people
You
for.
would sign the pro Cofnas
No, yeah,
petition.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
100%. Come
not the
on,
anti.
yeah. I wouldn't be platforming you if I were on the anti. But I will challenge you on this point, and I think you'd run rings around me if we talked about the actual argument. I mean, my I'll just give you my a priori position, and I admit I'm politically biased. Like I don't want these claims of biological differences that are relevant to intellect to be true. So I'll reflecting on that like last night, I'm like, yeah, I definitely have a political bias. But also it just seems a priori, it seems very I mean, a couple of the arguments given don't seem very compelling to me. So, okay, we've had 50 years of social policy that haven't worked to bridge the achievement gap between African Americans and whites. I mean, to infer from that okay, therefore genetic differences seems like a rather heroic leap. I mean, environmental differences can be very incorrigible, right? I mean, the example I gave on Twitter last night, and again, we're at a fairly low discourse here because I don't have competence on this literature, frankly, but like just intuitively, there are plenty of environmental differences that are deeply, deeply incorrigible. Like if we wanted to make Saudi Arabians Methodists, that's an environmental difference. They're not biologically Muslim, but we don't know how if that would even be possible, right? So the fact that the differences are incorrigible doesn't seem to me to be a good argument for them being genetic. And also, like I don't know, it just seems like I mean, my undergraduate degree was in economics and also philosophy, but economics, and it just seems to me a bit of a stretch that we can cash out these claims about biology from constructs of social science, and also like constructs in social science tend to be, as far as I recall, good social science theories are about predictive validity and causality. We can kind of set aside as maybe beyond these models a lot of the time. But what do you think of all that? Those are pretty scattered observations, but how would you come back at those? And I'm going to give you the moral objection, which I think I can articulate better. Ironically, because we just said morals are fake, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, uh, you say that you have a political bias, and to be honest, I'm not sure. Without a political bias, it's um, comes, I think, quite difficult to question the evidence, which is not I mean, in science, there's there's almost never one piece of evidence that just that everything turns on one experiment, which is a false view of science promoted by some philosophers of science, where there's a crucial experiment where um, it goes it goes a certain way, and now we all agree that that this it's established the truth of the new hypothesis. There are many lines of evidence, and in the case of a biological basis for race differences and intelligence, everything points in the same direction. It's not just in one particular country the gap proved resistant to change for 50 years. It's in every country where you have population representative groups of Africans, Europeans, East Asians, Ashkenazim. You get the same patterns of difference every time without any exception. The exceptions people point to are when they're not population representative groups. Uh, but when they are representative, it's always the same. It's always uh, the same when you give intelligence tests. It's the same pattern of differences. You look at crime rate. It's the same pattern of differences. Legitimacy, educational attainment, and when you come up with some sociological story for the differences in one particular uh, society that might seem plausible, you will be able to find societies where it doesn't apply, and yet you have exactly the same outcomes. And now, in the case you said, well, with Saudi Arabia, we have no idea how to turn them Methodist. So that shows that even though an outcome can be cultural, we might not know how to change it. But we do know how to change it. It's just that we don't have the political will or the ability to change it. But if you took everyone in Saudi Arabia and had them adopted at birth and raised by a Methodist, they'd be Methodist. And then you could airdrop them back into Saudi Arabia. Now everyone in Saudi Arabia would be Methodist. Now we do that. We have a version of that for testing race differences, which is cross-racial adoption studies. And it always turns out that by the time they become adults, so heritability of IQ is very low in children. So uh, adoption can have a large effect on IQ in childhood. But as the child grows up, and which are to ages where heritability of IQ become greater and greater, IQ goes down, and by adulthood, blacks who are adopted and raised by white families, their IQ turns out to be
Okay,
roughly the same.
let me just intrude in a couple of points. So I think on Africa, I think if you're comparing whites in Africa and blacks in Africa, there just is such an obvious differential history, and not just in terms of discrimination, but in just in terms of obvious cultural differences. I think it's just not a great example. I understand you could say all these countries, but to me, it seems very intuitive that there would be differences in the academic achievement of some person who comes from a tribal background in South Africa, let's say, versus someone whose parents were, physicians or teachers or in Rhodesia. I mean, they just have a totally different cultural context. In terms of the adoption studies, I mean, what I would want to say, and again, I don't want to make this a back and forth on this because I just lack the competence to do it, but there is obviously a difference in socialization for blacks, even if they have white parents, than for whites. So, look, the one point I'd make too is what about the Flynn effect data? I mean, again, I'm sure you've heard all this stuff because I'm not. I just this isn't my cup of tea. But the for me, it's very counterintuitive that that IQs have gone up so much with populations. And I understand it doesn't logically follow from that that the gap between them could be bridged, but it seems it's pretty compelling to me that like if you look at the African American population in the United States, they score higher in IQ tests than whites did earlier in the 20th century, I believe, right? So
But at any given time, there is always a gap. So the Flynn effect affects everybody, and everybody's IQ goes up to a point, and the Flynn effect can't go on forever. It's we've it's maybe a small amount of the Flynn effect was due to improved nutrition. Most of it was due uh, to education and test taking sophistication, and there's a limit to how much you can improve people's performance by education and that kind of thing. And we've reached the Flynn effects have maxed out, and it's not going up anymore. Um, and
why
the
is
gap is stuck.
axiomatic? Why is axiomatic? Maybe we don't know how to raise it higher. I can accept that. But why is it some axiom? This is the problem I have with hereditarians, essentially, the form of argument. They tend to assume, in my view, and again, I am not the best person to argue this with you by any means. I'm not competent on the subject, so we're going to try to run away from it in like a few minutes. The one point I'd raise is um, that that intuitively strikes me as weak about the hereditarian arguments is they tend to assume a highly incorrigible difference, which, and you describe this data that the Flynn effect is ending. I believe you, of course. They tend to assume that a highly incorrigible difference is therefore genetic, and it just seems to me that that does not follow logically.
But I'm not sure who says that an incorrigible difference
Well,
or
like people
highly
aren't growing up
incorrigible difference.
anymore.
I,
People aren't
I,
growing up anymore.
I mean, there's one piece of evidence in a very large package of evidence. And we also have brain size differences, which track intelligence differences among racial groups, uh, Africans, Europeans, East Asians. Um, you have the entire history of the world being
Well, okay,
consistent with
history
these
though,
different.
history. Here's I'm
Yeah,
on
okay,
stronger
you
ground
can
here.
pick apart
So
each piece of evidence.
why
You
are no,
can,
no, 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 let me challenge you on history because there I can actually articulate myself. So people in the Near East, including so for example, Coptic Egyptians. My mother's Coptic Egyptian. They score low. Even they are descended from the ancient Egyptians, as far as we know, right? You know, an incredible civilization. They score low on these tests, right? So are we gonna are we gonna cash out from that the the ancient Egyptians were stupid? I mean, and like Near
but
Easterners generally score low, including Christians who are not mixed with people from the Gulf or whatever. So I, I guess the Near Eastern IQ scores tend to me to be an argument in favor of environmentalism because this is the cradle of civilization. Yet they're low on these tests of cognitive ability today.
well, everybody is an environmentalist to some extent. Everybody acknowledges that um, you, the environment affects your score on the test. It's just that the question is, when raised in equal environments, are there gaps on average between? So you can only make this determination if you're comparing populations that are raised under
So
comparable
my
conditions.
problem is
At
I
the,
think you just cannot. I'm sorry for interrupting you, Nathan. I'll let you finish on this point. That we'll go to something else. But the last point I'll make is I think that you are underrating, and I'm not just talking about systematic racism or whatever the left says, but just all kinds of cultural differences, different experiences could be good, bad, or indifferent that people have who are African American versus white in the United States, for example. So I just don't think you can control for environment effectively. You can control over certain variables, but I think there's a lot of stuff we don't understand. But go ahead.
well,
You finish and then we'll go to another
so
subject.
I don't have I don't think there are very reliable data on populations outside Africans who we know. Really, we can measure the IQ of Africa uh, by looking at Africans in Western countries who are raised under comparable conditions, which suggests that their genetic potential of most African populations would probably be around 80. African Americans have IQs of around 85, with 25% white admixture. You know, the IQs of India or the Middle East, I don't think we know what their potential is.
I
Because
guess, look, I have political biases on this. I'm not, I think we're gonna bore the audience going back and forth this because I have political biases and I'm not well read in the subject. I defend your free speech 100% on it. Carry on with the research, but I don't intuitively buy that we can cash out from these social science models, these claims
so
of.
do you really believe that the Congo and Korea have exactly the same innate potential, and it's just
I'm not describing a view that I have. I'm describing skepticism of a view that you're putting forward. I don't know what the
but so your
potential of
my view is that there is a difference.
well, there are differences between populations because genetically isolated populations diverge. I am not, I'm not in the business of making assertions I don't believe I have adequate evidence for. And it could be my lack of reading, but I don't believe I have adequate evidence for assigning potential intelligence to a group of people that, you know, have just had a radically different experience than people in the Western world or Korea, you know. So
Well, they have. Where does the different experiences come from, and
yeah,
why are
okay.
they
Well,
acculturated differently? This is related to another thing I think we're going to talk about, which is the Jewish question, uh, because my explanation for why are there Jews everywhere in prominent positions is largely due to intelligence differences. And if you say, well, there's no difference between Jews and anyone else, then the conspiracy explanation becomes much more
so
becomes very
so
attractive.
this actually goes to a transition question I have, and it relates to the kind of putting a bow on this race realism stuff. So we agree that the differences in academic achievement and ability exist. That's just a fact, and these tests, right? Why is that not enough to fight what we'd agree to fight together, like DEI, affirmative action, these things? Like I'm 100% against this stuff. I think it's Sisyphean to try to make all groups equal in society. But why isn't it enough just to say there are these differences and we don't know how to change them? Why do we have to make incendiary? And again, I defend your right to do it. You shouldn't be punished. And if anyone goes after you, I'll sign any petition you want me to. But um, why do we have to make arguments that are incendiary? Is there any political benefit to it? Like, what is wrong with my argument that these differences exist? We don't know how to change them. Therefore, if we do these DEI things, affirmative action things, it's gonna have less meritocracy. Why can't we
I
do
don't
that?
understand why you're against DEI if you think that potentially everyone has the same capacity,
Because
the same innate
they don't
potential.
right now. Eventually, yeah, sure, maybe, but
But
they
you
don't
think
right now, and we
theoretically
don't know
we
how
could
to change
arrange,
it.
we could change, we
Sure,
could, there is
sure,
some way we don't, you say we don't know. Okay, so
yeah.
let's find out. Maybe it's
We should
much,
keep trying,
but
but we
we keep
shouldn't.
trying. And
No,
so
but we shouldn't be
that's what
rigging. We
wokeism
shouldn't
is.
be.
That's,
We no, 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 no. Wokeism says, look, conservative view is this is the world as it is. These differences exist, right? We have to deal with the world as it is. We can't be like having doctors that are less competent because we want to do social engineering and have equal outcomes and change something that comes about through, let's say, history, right? Or culture. We don't know how to change this, and we have to just live with the world we have. You don't think that's a coherent argument?
you're saying the world we have is one in which uh, African Americans could have the same outcomes as Ashkenazim or
Yeah,
Japanese
yeah.
Americans,
I don't think
right?
that is
They could. It's just we don't
intuitively
know
ruled out.
how to produce that,
Right.
but we could. But they have the same potential to to achieve in the same way as
Yeah, but we don't know how to
Ashkenazim.
turn
Okay, we don't know. So
cultures
I
into
say
each other.
but the most important thing we could possibly do is find
Why?
out
Why?
why, because there's a, an enormous loss of potential and suffering. People not uh, people having bad outcomes with dealing with crime and frustration and
Well,
poverty. And
crime we can deal with through other means. Then we don't need to culturally engineer. We need to just have a more vigorous approach to crime, and also a more humane prisons. Like I
yeah,
favor
but
that.
okay. So your solution is toss them in prison, but you're
Right.
saying,
Well,
but
treat them better in
theoretically,
prison
we could
too. Treat
arrange
people better in prison.
the environment so they don't need to go to prison.
How we don't know how to do this. Clearly, we
But
don't.
but if they are the same, if they have the same potential, we need to figure out how to bring about this outcome because
But
it should be possible.
so let's say let's go back to the example of the Near East, right? Let's say that like Coptic Egyptians score low on these tests, right? Let's say Egyptians have the same potential. Maybe they don't. Maybe they do. I don't know. Whatever you think. Let's say they had the same potential as Swedes. Should we really be like investing in some Manhattan project to transform their culture? I mean, it seems. Also, why do we know it would work? Like it just, I guess the main premise which I fall back on. I want to get away from this because I'm just not competent in the technical literature that you are. Is that I think that to say a difference is incorrigible, and I'm not saying that's your only argument, but I'm saying I've heard this from many of these people, that to say a difference is incorrigible does not follow that it is not environment.
Okay, so if
And for me,
the
for
North,
me at least,
if
the Flynn stuff gives me some more additional skepticism because I don't think many people would intuitively think, well, the African American community today is is intellectually superior to whites for most of American history, which is what
so
the data seem to show.
okay, so um, North Korea is one, I don't know exactly, one of the
Hmm.
poorest countries in the world, right?
Hmm.
Uh, People starving, uh, huge parts of the country, basically everything outside the capital, extremely undeveloped, uh, primitive in every way. If the North Korean regime fell and they opened their borders, then the world would show what they think of their potential. There would be a Manhattan Project. Uh, there would be everybody would be investing in North Korea because we know that even though it's the poorest country in the world, in 40 years they're going to
Okay,
be
well,
exporting computer chips, and
maybe.
we know that. And
Why is Ukraine before the war? Obviously, the war is you can't talk about. Why before the war did Ukraine have a lower GDP per capita than Botswana? I mean, Ukraine is one of the poorest countries in the world. They're overwhelmingly white. I
again,
mean,
it's caught in a tug of war with the West and Russia. My uh, I don't think that anything I'm saying implies that environment uh, can't affect outcomes,
right? You're not implying
and
that,
that
but
there can be political factors that stand in the way of certain interventions that ideally we would like to perform.
I guess the one point I'd fall back on, and then I'm going to run away from this because, again, I know I'm not competent on this subject, but and I care about it. Like I have a political bias against your views, so I'm not going to pretend that's not the case. But I just think that just because we can't change something or we haven't figured out how to do it yet, in the context of like social policy, which is a very clumsy, and education, which is very clumsy politically influenced domain, I don't think it follows that. I don't think that's strong evidence that we can't do it. And I also don't think that we need to just say, okay, let's just change every standard and abandon meritocracy to achieve racial equity. I think you can make a very coherent argument against these things without. We disagree on that maybe, but I think you can make a very coherent argument that just says the differences exist. We don't know how to change them, so we're not going to rig the admissions process to institutions or admit people to medical school with lower MCAT. I mean, there's many reasons to do not to do that, that without like these arguments. But you have a free speech right to engage in them, and I guess that leads to my next question. Have you, for these views, how on earth did you get? I mean, like I'm on the political right, and I'm like slightly, I want to defend your free speech rights, and I do, but slightly like, ooh, But how on earth did you get a position at Cambridge with with your viewpoints? Like, how did some woke people try to go after you? It's just it's remarkable to me that you did. I mean, I'm glad you haven't been terminated or anything, but how did that happen?
Well, I wasn't hired on the basis of my work on race
Hmm.
differences. Um, uh, I other other things which doesn't always get as much attention on Twitter, but actually, um, most of my work was on philosophy of biology and metaethics, and that was what I was um, hired for. Now, the UK uh, is about 10 years behind the
Hmm.
United States when it comes to wokeism.
Agreed with you there.
So, yeah, I never got a job in the United States. I've generally been a lot more successful in the UK.
Hmm.
Uh, After I was hired, there were um, two petitions to fire me. So first there was a very kind of weak hit piece in the student newspaper, and that was picked up by the Daily Mail. So I was in the Daily Mail as they're saying I'm a racist. And then there were two student
Daily
petitions to
Mail is
fire me.
like really trashy tabloid, though, right?
They just publish any
Yeah,
garbage
yeah.
that will get clicks.
They don't really have politics. I think they just want to like have really inflammatory, shocking
No,
headlines.
it's just for clicks.
Yeah,
That's all they
yeah.
care about.
Go on. Yeah.
And interestingly, both petitions to fire me were started by American
Hmm.
students,
White female
American
Americans.
women, both women from America.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean
Um,
yeah, I agree. Like my experience in Britain, I have to say my first year, I was like at LSE, I was, kind of hunkered down. I was like, okay, I'm ready to go. I'm not gonna say anything I don't believe, but I'm ready for to be like blasted with both barrels from woke people. And no, it never really happened. And yeah, I think it's in terms of the feminism, it's more woke than it is in terms of like race politics. I mean, I think it may be too because the British have a pretty compelling rhetorical narrative that's snappy. Like if people say, "Oh, the colonialism, you're so evil, white British people," like they can just say, "Well, like British Empire is one of the prime reasons that slavery, at least in the old sense of traditional sense of slavery, is largely a thing of the past in the world."
well, also, they're they seem to be more worked up about the trans stuff
Yeah, I
than
noticed that.
even America. I know it's a big thing in America, but they're really out of their minds when it comes to trans stuff in the UK.
Yeah, I've
So
noticed
I
that
think
gets a lot of oxygen. Yeah.
like when after the Daily Mail article was published, um, oh, actually, when the student newspaper ran the hit piece about me, the front page was about Kathleen Stock, the
Mm,
gender critical feminist. So then I was on page 8. So like they called me a controversial race researcher, gets
yeah, yeah.
prestigious fellowship. That was 8-page news and everything. But the spotlight was on Stock for some very anodyne claims about
You haven't you
uh,
haven't been your daily activities, you haven't like faced substantive interference or backlash.
nothing like that. No.
Oh wow, that's yeah, in the United States you couldn't function. I mean, I don't think you could function. The best
It
defense you'd
might
get in the
be.
United States is like someone like me in academia. I mean, you couldn't function in the United States. So I'm glad you got a position at Cambridge.
Oh, I'm having a blast.
Yeah, glad you are. The Yeah, I think I'm also going to be looking in because like again like because I reject again I'd have to read more into this to have a strong position, but because I'm very much inclined to reject the race realism stuff, at least as you articulated it. My views are less incendiary than yours in the context of academia, but I just still like being opposed to DEI and affirmative action. I don't think you could get a
No, but
position.
I'll just, my view, if I
Mhm.
were an environmentalist, I would be woke, because I see wokeism as the logical consequence of
I think
environmental.
that's too simplistic a framing. So that I disagree with, because if we can't change something, are we really going to have? If we have no idea how to change something and it exists, are we going to say, okay, in pursuit of more experiments to change this, we're going to have less competent doctors and we're going to have racial discrimination against whites and Asians? It doesn't follow to me. And
Well,
also, like sniffing out the
we can't change something and we don't know how to change something. Those are very different concepts.
right, but
And
we don't know how it's important.
but I mean, if you're an environmentalist, would you say we have no idea what the environment, what aspect of the environment produces these differences? It's a very strange kind of environmentalism,
We
because
could know
if,
to some extent, but we don't know how to change them.
but hereditarianism explains everything. That's a simple explanation that explains everything. You say you reject that, you believe in environmentalism, but you can't say what part of the environment produces the difference. So
I don't
let's,
want to say I don't want to commit myself to a emphatic position when I haven't um, done enough research on the subject. So that's the first thing. But uh, no, I would just reiterate my point, and then the viewers can decide whether it's persuasive or not. Yeah, I'm inclined to believe environmentalism because of history, because of uh, IQ scores of groups that have had great intellectual achievement traditionally, and often have great intellectual achievement when they go into the diaspora and don't anymore, and are genetically very similar to what they were. Like take like Levantine Christians, Iraqi Christians, Egyptian Christians, like low on these tests of cognitive ability, you know, genetic heirs to great civilizations. And also, for me at least, the Flynn effect data intuitively is pretty remarkable. I mean, the fact is that according to these tests, African Americans today are intellectually superior to whites through most of U.S. history. So,
well, intellectually superior is not the right
well,
term. They score,
intelligence, higher
they would
IQ.
have scored, no, even higher in intelligence. I don't think is correct. You're somebody isn't more intelligent. Joe Schmo, who gets a higher IQ score than Abraham Lincoln would have gotten if he took an IQ test, isn't smarter than Abraham Lincoln in any sense,
Well,
or more
also
intelligent.
now you're treading upon another concern I have with this. I think that intelligence, I think that these tests can be very useful for as predictions of competence and how well you'll do if you receive an education and so forth, right? I think they're obviously effective in this regard. I read enough to know they have very good predictive validity. But I mean, do they? Yeah, of course I don't believe Joe Schmo, who would maybe score higher than Lincoln, is smarter than Lincoln. But that I think points to a shortcoming in the tests, that they don't truly, in like the Platonic sense, like intelligence is almost like a Platonic concept. You know, I'm not saying that we can't have intelligence as some practical social science concept. I'm not like taking the Stephen Jay Gould position, which is a bit ridiculous. But I think that we should have an asterisk always. We should say these are very useful tests, very useful, but there is some platonic, abstract, artistic quality to intelligence that the tests don't capture, right?
I don't interpret IQ tests in that way. There are some psychometricians who do think that who believe that there is
Hmm.
some entity, theoretical entity called general intelligence, and it's a real thing. And one day we'll discover exactly what its properties are. I don't believe that. Uh, I believe their IQ measures a general functioning ability of the brain to function effectively. Uh, so different abilities are correlated with each other because the same gene that improves neural efficiency in one area improves it in other areas. So test scores will be correlated with each other. Uh, if you so you can discover through statistical analysis an underlying factor to intelligence scores, which is not a huge surprise. And if you can only give, uh, provide one number that has to give the most predictive value about an individual, would be their IQ. That doesn't.
I'm not denying the predictive validity of these data. They're highly predictively valid. I'm just
And
saying, yeah.
people who are raised under comparable conditions uh, tend to get different IQ scores. And
That's
those are called.
those are the weasel words, though. I think that, and I don't mean weasel words. I mean just, you know, those are the words where I think we disagree on. Can we actually have comparable conditions? And I'm not saying, oh, it's all. It's just a different socialization. It's a different culture. African Americans have a different culture than white Americans do. So I don't.
Well,
It's
of
not
course,
all
because
Kendyism where we say, oh, it's all racist. No, there's cultural differences. There's certain things that some cultures emphasize and excel at, and certain things other cultures emphasize and excel at. So I don't think we can just say that the socialization of a black kid who grows up in the same environment as a white kid, pardon me, in the same household, let's say, is the same. I think they're going to be different, and it's not just going to be bad, right? I'm not saying it's all oppression or whatever. But no, it'll be different, and I just think we can't. Yeah, go ahead.
where does this culture come from? The culture,
Okay,
a
well,
population with IQ 85 is less likely to have a culture of math and homework than a population with an IQ of
I think
105.
that's question begging, chicken egg stuff, and it's not very useful. We should move on to something else really because of my relative lack of competence on the subject. Like, I mean, you've read, you know, you engage in this literature. I don't, right? So, okay. Um. Anyway, um, yeah. So you're able to work and function in Cambridge. That's good, without being canceled or whatever. That's interesting and good. Um, okay. So let's talk now about the KMAC stuff. Can you uh, describe his views and your response to them quickly? Because some of the people that are listening will not be familiar, although I think a number will.
So Kevin MacDonald, psychologist at Cal State Long Beach, now retired, uh, is an has a theory that Judaism is a group evolutionary strategy, that Jews have genetic and cultural adaptations to undermine Gentile society for their own evolutionary benefit. And he says that liberal multiculturalism was a Jewish invention. It was promoted by strongly identified Jews like Franz Boas, according to him, and Sigmund Freud, in order to promote Jewish interests. And Jews were a necessary condition for the rise of the left in the 20th century. So these Jewish activists, intellectual activists. So if it were not for the Jews and the Jewish group evolutionary strategy, we would not have gone left. There would not have been a rise of leftism and now culminating in wokeism and open borders and multiculturalism and all that stuff.
Yeah. So his main argument is that he believes that Jews play a major role in these leftist intellectual movements, culminating with wokeism and so on, and that they did so for ethnocentric reasons. Is that right? So I've never fully try to put this in like the most charitable terms possible, because I literally don't quite understand McDonald's argument. So why is the ethnocentrism cashed out through leftism or multiculturalism? I don't really fully understand
So,
that.
so the idea is Jews have these traits like high intelligence and high
Hmm.
ethnocentrism, which were selected partly through by eugenic practices within the Jewish community. So the non not the unintelligent and non-ethnocentric are um, expelled or ostracized, or don't pass on their genes as
Hmm.
much as as the others. So you have a population of ethnocentric intellectuals, and they think, how can we advance Jewish interests? And the way to do that is to undermine Gentile cohesion among Gentiles while preserving cohesion and group separatism and racial purity among Jews. So they promote, according to MacDonald, they promote multiculturalism, multiracialism, and open borders for Gentiles in Gentile countries, but they promote racial purity and closed borders for Israel.
Okay, so in his view, is the there is a motive among he claims there's a motive among Jews to harm the majority population in the countries where they're domiciled, like to actually harm by introducing other elements, or is the claim that this is like somehow subconscious?
So it can be either conscious or unconscious. He himself is not entirely clear about the
Okay,
extent to which it's conscious or unconscious.
okay. And so you of course challenged. I mean, I think you attacked him in two main ways. You challenged the premise. Well, first of all, you made the claim that much of Jewish overrepresentation can be attributed to what you call the default hypothesis. So higher intelligence, higher academic achievement, and so on, and urbanization, like the disproportionate location of Jews in urban centers that have a disproportionate role in cultural and political life.
Well, the way that MacDonald makes his case for his theory is, well, part of it is he just points out that there are a lot of leftist
Hmm.
Jews, a lot of Jews who are leaders of leftist intellectual movements. Um, However, you might notice that
Hmm.
Jews are overrepresented in all intellectual
Italian
movements.
fascism, they were overrepresented in before 1938.
I mean, this is something that I get into in great
Yeah.
detail in my final response to MacDonald. Fascism was a Jewish invention.
Yeah.
Fascism, the idea of combining nationalism and socialism, was Margarita Sarfati's idea, a Jewish woman. Everything, but not just fascism, but also activities that have nothing to do with politics or leftism. Jews turn out to be overrepresented in basically everything that isn't overtly anti-Semitic. And even in the overtly anti-Semitic movements, they're often
Yeah,
overrepresented. I
Iran
know
owns today, right?
the
I mean,
not to the not usually not to the extent that they're overrepresented in the non-anti-Semitic ones, but even in the anti-Semitic ones,
anecdotally, I know multiple people. So one of whom I've actually managed to deprogram, another of whom programmed himself, multiple Jewish people who were in the NJP, like neo-Nazi sphere. So I think even today, I wouldn't be surprised if like in explicitly neo-Nazi anti-Jewish movements you had proportionate or slightly above proportionate Jewish representation.
yeah, but it's not as
Right, of
I
course not.
mean,
Of course not.
it's
There's an
not
obvious
as good.
incentive.
Uh,
But like,
so
I mean, you don't have to. Another thing game McDonald plays is so if somebody, so you're say you're a Jew and you're against the Nazis, right? In the 1930s, you can be totally indifferent to your ethnicity, and for simple reasons of self-interest. I want access to public facilities. I want to be able to hit on that foul line over there. You can have totally self-interested reasons. Oh, I don't want my family to be hurt. You can have totally self-interested reasons that don't reflect a broader ethnic consciousness for being opposed to anti-Semitic movements if you're Jewish.
and also McDonald often conflates uh, kind of normal group identity, like I don't want all my friends and family to be murdered, with ethnocentrism and a high level of ethnocentrism, and showing that a Jew cares about the Holocaust demonstrates that he's ethnocentric and must care about Jewish interests, which doesn't follow. so my proposal is the what I call the default hypothesis that Jewish overrepresentation across the board is explained by the same factors, the most important of which is intelligence. Jews are have higher average intelligence, something like 112, 110, 112
Mhm.
IQ. Therefore, they're overrepresented in the leaders of the leftist movements that MacDonald doesn't like. For the same reason, they're overrepresented in among mathematicians and physicists and computer
Right.
scientists and chess players and libertarians, which is a movement he didn't
Mhm.
particularly object to, and
Yeah, I mean,
um,
libertarianism, you have Mises, Rothbard, Rand, like three of the, maybe the three most important fake
Milton
intellectual,
Friedman.
Middle Friedman. Yeah, I mean, the majority appear to
Uh,
be Jewish.
uh, so actually, I was just about to tweet this uh, in John Tomasi and another philosopher wrote a book about libertarianism, and they mentioned the four most important libertarians, who I think are the ones that you just mentioned. All four are Jewish.
Yeah,
They didn't make a point of that, but it's interesting that yeah, the top four basically are Jewish.
that's pretty remarkable. I mean, yeah, I mean, but I think urbanization, higher like intellectual achievement, that to me is a persuasive explanation. And in terms of ethnocentrism, it strikes me, and you provided data about like I think the majority of American Jews are in inter-ethnic marriages, right?
Yeah, and actually, I Eric
Inter,
Kaufman
yeah,
uh,
okay.
uh, published an article with some data after my paper came out, um, that now I think it's 80% of Jews who've married in the last like 15 to 20 years are intermarried, and of secular Jews, not so yeah, the secular liberal Jews, who are the ones that MacDonald says were promoting this strategy to preserve Jewish racial purity, they have absolutely no interest in group continuity. Uh, and the intermarriage rate is the most obvious manifestation of that.
Right. I don't know how the responses are rather humorous. I've heard on the intermarriage matter, where I mean, it really is an extraordinary expression of non-ethnocentrism. I mean, um, to especially when you consider that Jews still have a, maybe in the context of the modern West, a little bit anachronistic notion of descent, right? From bilateral descent, but matrilineal, right? At least a large portion of the community still takes this seriously. So you're basically, in terms of the men who are marrying non-Jews, you're basically saying, I'm quite happy to have a good chunk of the Jewish community just regard my son or daughter as not Jewish. And they do this with equanimity, the majority. So that doesn't seem to be ethnocentrism to me. The responses I've heard are very humorous on this. It's like Eric Stryker said, they do this for one generation to marry up into like better Gentile families, and then they repurify the blood like a couple generations down. Did you hear that remark?
Well, MacDonald has actually said something
Oh yeah,
like this, that intermarriage can have benefits to the Jewish community, and he gives the example of Jared Kushner marrying Ivanka Trump and then influencing U.S. policy toward Israel. And I mean, there are a lot of problems with that. I mean, he married Ivanka Trump several years before anyone had the idea that his father-in-law was going to be president. The idea that he married Ivanka Trump is part of a scheme to influence, um, to benefit Israel is
it's
is
almost mental
not
illness. I mean,
supported.
if you heard a friend of yours is say he's Jewish had a romantic relationship with Ivanka Trump, you wouldn't just say like a sober mind would not jump to, yeah, okay, that's a plot
That's the
to
only
help the Jews.
explanation that McDonald can think of.
For a heterosexual man to date Ivanka Trump, yeah.
Uh, and okay, but let's say it's true that Jews could benefit from
Mhm,
some strategic intermarriage.
mhm.
Like, yeah, Esther marries the king in ancient Persia and then intervenes on behalf of the Jewish people. So that was good for Jewish interests. Uh, but a marriage rate of 80% doesn't make any sense on that theory. There's no evidence that these 80% of Jews are marrying up or politically influential people, and that will somehow promote Jewish interests. It's just a completely evidenceless theory.
Yeah, it's just an attempt to rescue the theory by finding something that is logically possible, but for which there's no evidence, you know? I've actually noticed
And
this with Holocaust denial. I've noticed this with Holocaust denial. They'll try to find something that is logically possible, but for which there's no evidence to explain away evidence against them. Right. They'll just search for it, even though there's no evidence supporting this. Like the example I'll give really quick is there are documents suggesting that the room that witnesses at Auschwitz said was the main gas chamber, Leichenkeller 1, Corpskeller 1, which is there's documents referring to that as a Vergassungskeller or gassing cellar, right? So then, like some Holocaust deniers in response to that say, okay, it was a delousing chamber, it was a gas chamber for clothes, even though there's no evidence of that. And there's actually evidence against that because all the fumigation chambers are listed in other documents, and Leichenkeller 1 isn't one. But the point is, the similarity, I think, is they find some logically possible explanation that has no evidence to try to save their theory. And it's obvious, like they're putting a predetermined conclusion. So, like here, yeah, there's just no evidence that the majority of American Jews who are marrying non-Jews are engaged in some kind of strategy to help the Jews or or something or other. Yeah.
and as I also point out, MacDonald in his books explicitly predicted that the opposite would happen, and that the Jewish community would establish barriers to lower the intermarriage rate, would go down, and they would preserve their racial purity. The whole point of the evolutionary strategy is to promote racial purity. He says that explicitly, that there are four goals of the group evolutionary strategy. The first of which is
Mm.
to preserve the Jewish gene pool. Uh, so, yes, this does not square with what he said. And now, after his prediction turned out wrong, he's come up with an elaborate story that doesn't seem very convincing.
Yeah. Could you describe briefly, and I'm largely complimentary your work here, but I'm going to give a couple criticisms at the end. So we'll get over the if people are getting bored of the compliment festival, we'll end that soon. Don't worry. But do you think that could you describe some of the historical claims MacDonald is mistaken about or misrepresenting regarding like ethnocentrically motivated Jews in these ideological movements, these leftist movements?
So, and people like Franz Boas, who he portrays as an ethnic activist, um, who just cares about Jewish interests, and he comes up with this idea to deny race in order to undermine anti-Semitism and thereby protect Jewish
Hmm.
interests, which is the only thing that he really cares about. There isn't an iota of evidence that Boaz had special concern for Jewish interests or that he even identified as a Jew. Uh,
Hmm.
he identified as a German.
Right.
Uh, he called himself a German.
Right.
During the First World War, he even risked his career to say that he supports Germany as a German. And so I've addressed this in my papers, and on that particular issue, uh, there's a Substack writer, Viver. I cite
Oh
him
yeah, yeah. No,
in
I
my
know him.
paper.
He's a viewer of mine. I like him. He's
he's
my guy.
gone
Yeah.
uh,
Hmm.
a
Very
lot
good
of detail
Substack, by the
about.
way. Will Viver. Everyone should. If you're listening, and you don't subscribe to that, I'm gonna punch you in the face when I've been working out lately, so that's not a it's a scary thing. Go ahead, Nathan.
Uh, and also with the Frankfurt School theorists, many of whom were Jewish, but uh, no evidence that, yeah, although a lot of them were very unhappy about the Holocaust. And so MacDonald
They're German
says,
Jews.
look,
Yeah.
look, they were against the Holocaust. So that
Hmm.
shows that they care deeply about Jewish interests, which is not a good argument.
And it's on their mind, the fact that they were uprooted and had family and had relatives killed. Like the fact that that's a salient issue they're writing about shows their ethnocentric. It's just really silly.
So a lot of Frankfurt School theorists were, against tribalism and
Hmm.
making divisions between people. So MacDonald uh, argues that, but they accepted the Jewish separatism and Jewish ethnocentrism with no actual evidence, but just if they didn't
Hmm.
specifically uh, attack Jewish ethnocentrism in the way that MacDonald likes, then he says that means they accepted Jewish
Hmm.
ethnocentrism, even though there's no actual evidence for that. In fact, all of these people who commented on Israel said they wanted open borders for Israel,
Yeah.
and they used the same arguments that
Right.
they use for open borders in other countries, saying that Israel can't survive as if it closes itself off to the world, and that was what Marcuse
Right. And by like the
said.
60s, Marcuse is losing interest in anti-Semitism. He's focusing on like black civil rights, for example, which is consistent with somebody who's just concerned about racial inequality or discrimination, you know.
And Boaz, his concern was, as far as racism went, it was mainly with um, African Americans, discrimination against African
Hmm.
Americans, and he thought that the solution to racism and anti-Semitism was the same, which was that everyone should just intermarry themselves out of existence. So he was
It's a
looking
very
forward to the
very
day
ethnocentric view. Yeah.
when there are no, and he himself uh, intermarried. Although MacDonald emphasizes in Culture of Critique that he married a Jew, in fact,
It's a
he
misstatement
didn't.
of fact. Yeah.
Uh,
Um, yeah. Look, one other point I'll ask, and then I'll get to like a couple of the moderate criticisms. Um, Did McDonald ever talk about? So I think of Frankfurt School is influential, but I think more influential, or at least as influential, would be the French postmodernists, who are, I think, almost all Gentile, right? To read
so I,
can't pronounce-
in an
did he talk
article
about them or no?
I compared. I don't think I mentioned this in the academic papers, but I in a popular article I think I pointed out the French existentialists,
Yeah, like
which
Sartre, yeah,
was completely
Camus,
Gentile led
yeah.
movement, but
Also,
in
de
many respects.
Beauvoir was, I don't think was she Jewish? I don't think so. She was a leading theorist of feminism.
Well, yeah, the founders of feminism were like uh, Wollstonecraft,
I'm
and
gonna see if she's Jewish. I'm gonna look that.
I'm quite sure she's not.
She's not. Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. But if she is Jewish, then I gave the Wignets like a taking point. So Simone de Beauvoir. Yeah, she's not Jewish. Okay, that's good. Yeah. Okay. So all right, now here's the I guess skepticism, if you will. So I think your work was great. McDonald is full of shit, but I think you should have engaged him. I don't think we should censor McDonald. I don't think he should be censored on Silicon Valley, much less by like state or something ridiculous like that. I think we agree on that. Like the problem is you cannot trust Silicon Valley to determine what is hate, isn't, what is intellectually frivolous, and what is serious, what is genocide denial, and what is revisionism. We can't trust them to do that. So we could say, okay, this Holocaust denial book is, or this KMAC article lacks like seriousness, but censoring it is giving them a very dangerous power. I think we agree on that.
Well, people want
Yeah,
to see us argue, right? So,
yeah. Well, it's good for our YouTube profiles and social media profiles, but also I think it's just a wrong-headed approach on many levels. But here's one thing I would raise a question about. Was an academic journal, as opposed to like a Substack or a YouTube debate, was that the right place for McDonald's to be engaged? Because I don't know that his work meets a certain threshold of academic seriousness. I mean, you know what I mean? Do you think there's any do you think it does, or do you think there's any truth to what I'm saying there? Why
well,
not like
I
a
think his
Substack
work
debate or something? Yeah.
from just an objective academic standard, I don't think his work is worse than a great deal of what's
Okay.
published
Well, we
without
might agree on
controversy.
that.
So why should we invoke a special standard?
Hmm.
Maybe we should have standards like that, but then
It would
they
have
should
quite a bit
apply
of
to everything.
it would
So
have quite a bit of implications. It would like eliminate a very sizable percentage of what is published in academic journals.
the
That's
vast
correct. I agree
majority of
with
what
you.
is published,
A
if you're going to
lot.
hold it to
Yeah.
that standard, should be retracted. But people are not trying to retract any of that. They're
Yeah.
only trying to retract MacDonald
Hmm.
and other work that they don't like for political reasons.
Hmm.
So, um,
I think that's a fair point, and that's kind of taking the wind out of my sails to some degree. I mean, like with the lack of seriousness in the academy now, it's difficult to just take a particularly unpopular expression of unseriousness and say, "Oh, we're going to publish this." I mean, yeah, I mean the academic journals have publishing rubbish all the time, you know. So it has the right political.
Kevin MacDonald's reply to me in the philosophy journal Philosophia
Yeah,
did get
okay. Explain
retracted.
that
Yeah.
drama. Explain that. Well, they obviously shouldn't have retracted having published it, but let's go through because people like drama. I'm learning that as a content creator, unfortunately. But go through this whole saga, like who got in trouble, who were the blue-haired people screaming at, like what was this journal? Just give us the story here.
So, Philosophia is an Israeli philosophy journal,
I remember that.
uh, which uh, had although it's a respectable journal, not highly ranked, but it was sort of respectable, and it had a reputation for publishing kind of controversial
Hmm?
articles. Um, and I submitted my second paper on Kevin MacDonald, which addressed some things the Jewish role in the 1965 Immigration Act that led to essentially open borders or mass immigration in the United States. Um, and MacDonald then published a reply to me in Philosophia. And the day after that, the associate editor of the journal resigned in protest. And then the philosophy blog Daily News, which is run by Justin Weinberg, ran a post complaining about both my and MacDonald's papers and kind of attributing some of MacDonald's ideas to me. Weinberg is not uh, well known for his reading comprehension abilities.
Wasn't Jason Stanley, who's a very silly, like an aggressively silly figure, wasn't he involved in this as
He was
well?
involved in another
Okay.
paper on
Okay.
race differences. But
I see. Yeah.
so then Justin Weinberg contacted the editor of Philosophia and the journal's publisher, Springer. Now, the only reason to contact Springer is because he's trying to initiate a retraction.
Uh, Yeah.
There's no other logical explanation
No,
because
yeah.
the
They don't,
the, uh,
because they're not
the
familiar with the content or anything.
so the spring it's not Springer's job to oversee peer review. Right? You only
Right.
complain to the publisher if you think something has gone wrong,
It's a
and you go over the
repository.
other
They
thing.
collect peer-reviewed work. They're
Yeah.
basically a database.
Yeah, so,
And
but Springer will intervene if something illegal has happened
uh-huh.
or somebody has uh, done something outrageously inappropriate or unethical. So the editor of the journal, Asa Kasher, the editor in chief, he turned out to be an enormous disappointment,
Hmm.
and he immediately apologized for publishing both articles, including mine, even though I was,
Hmm.
well, although I was taking the politically correct position by disagreeing with MacDonald, I was also um, talked openly about race differences and some other issues, which was not politically correct. So Kasher said that he rejected publishing both articles, and then uh, Springer and Kasher initiated what they called post-publication peer review. And this situation was greatly exacerbated because Ed Dutton announced on Twitter that he had been one of the peer reviewers of MacDonald's paper for Philosophia. Uh,
Hmm.
so Dutton is
I'm very I've very rudimentary familiarity with Dutton. Can you describe really quick Dutton's attempt to rescue? I know who Dutton is. In a very like I know he's like a friend of Richard Spencer, for example. Um, and he's like a theologian. And he's interested. He writes about like race and intelligence and stuff. But can you describe Dutton's response to you? Didn't he try to
so this is
rebut
yeah, this
you?
is another incident. So
Okay. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Dutton wrote a reply to me in the journal Evolutionary Psychological Science, arguing that the evidence says Jews are ethnocentric, more ethnocentric than Gentile whites, and that intermarriage rates are not a measure of ethnocentrism. And he had some survey data that he claimed showed Jews are more ethnocentric. So I and he had some other um, arguments, just attempting to defend MacDonald from my initial critique, and then I wrote a rejoinder to him in Evolutionary Psychological Science. So Dutton is not a mainstream figure, so I mean he's only kind of marginally connected to academia, and as
What
far as
was Dutton's?
credentials,
So what was Dutton's? So one thing I remember reading about Dutton because like talked to him a few times just on Twitter, right? And I talk to Spencer sometimes. I'm trying to like help help him move himself on his ideological journey away from like the alt right stuff he was into 2017 or whatever. But um, what was that scandal related to Dutton? Was it so there was like some plagiarism thing? Was that just fake because of his views, or did he actually engage in academic misconduct? You don't understand, or you don't know? Because I remember
I
reading
don't.
some.
I'm not
Okay, you
familiar
don't
with
know. Then
the
let's not
incident.
talk about it because we don't know. Mhm.
So, but in any case, Dutton wrote on Twitter that he was one of the reviewers, and then Justin Weinberg then started telling everyone that because Dutton doesn't have a degree in
Right.
a relevant subject. His degree is in theology, as I believe. Uh, so from their perspective, he shouldn't be peer reviewing. Um, he wasn't a competent peer reviewer, and it is a hard. It's hard for Kasher to defend using Dutton as a reviewer, but in any case, that's what he did. So uh, that's who he
I
chose
mean,
to
he's
use as a
also
reviewer.
Israeli based. I imagine Israel doesn't have this woke stuff very much at all. I mean,
No,
maybe
it
it
definitely
does.
does, especially in
Okay.
academia.
Oh, okay.
It's not
I mean,
as woke.
I've seen polls where like nearly half of the Israeli Jewish population supports like compulsory transfer of Palestinians. I don't understand how that kind of
Yeah, but it's the
attitude can be compatible with woke,
because so Israel is like less than 50%
right?
Ashkenazi,
Yeah.
but the secular liberal Ashkenazi
Okay, they're woke.
Jews are. It's not. It's not as bad as it is in the West. I mean, there's a limit to how woke you can be when you've got rockets raining down on you, and you have to face reality in a way that American Jews don't. But certainly, Israeli academics, many of them
Okay. Yeah, I'm
are
not
woke.
familiar with the academic scene in Israel, really. The contemporary academic scene, like the
Sure,
academics
is
I've.
not woke, and he's kind of conservative, and I believe he's religious.
Hmm.
So you wouldn't expect him to be. In fact, Kasher uh, wrote an email to me to congratulate me on publishing the paper and that it had gotten a
Hmm.
lot of views in his opinion. And
Wasn't like the most
uh,
views ever of like an online like art. You got all the Spurgs, like the JQ Spurgs, like reading that, hate reading it.
not that one. I had other. I have a uh, by the standards of academic papers. I have a lot of download. That one is only like I think like 15,000 or something. But still, for even for a philosophy paper,
No,
that's quite a lot.
that's pretty remarkable. I think you actually persuaded me that. I mean, given the very low caliber of so much what is published. I mean, you've had multiple experiments. It's pretty well known experiments. SoCal was the first, but there was more recently with like James Lindsay, some of these guys where they just like publish sham papers and they got published in academic journal where they're trying to be silly and it got published. So if they use the right ideological language, so I think you've persuaded me on that point that yeah, it should have been published in academic journal because I mean, like MacDonald is not particular. I wouldn't call him particularly serious, but he's more serious than like the conceptual penis or like, dogs are not are not respecting norms of sexual consent because of uh,
And also the
the
fact
example
that
given
people
by our society. Yeah.
so it's an interesting discussion.
Uh,
Under what conditions should we publish a paper? Should we
yeah. Right.
entertain an idea in the pages of an academic journal?
Uh-huh.
And I think one of the reasons to devote journal space to an idea is that people believe in the idea. The idea
Mm-hmm.
is influential. I mean, there are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of um, ideas that are obviously wrong, like we were talking about moral realism, and
Yeah.
but also in science, you have something like behaviorism,
Mm-hmm.
which and behaviorism was always ridiculous. I mean, everybody, you just look at an animal being born and then performing a complex series of instinctual behaviors that
Right.
behaviorists said is impossible. You can just
I
go
mean,
look at that.
when I take my dog to, outside to for a walk, and she, uh, does what she does, she'll kick any residue of like dirt or sand or whatever over, you know, what the product of her waste. Like that's not something I taught her to do.
So and yet, at least when it was a live controversy, it wouldn't make sense to say we should never publish be a defensive
Right.
behaviorism
Yeah.
because there
Yeah,
was a
I think I agree
controversy
with
about
you on
it. Yeah.
this. I think I agree with you on this. Actually. So, um, I mean, I think there have to be some limits. So I don't know if you've ever seen my content. I am, and it's ironic because so you've had people criticizing you. I had one lady, I'm not going to mention her name, but she's an academic, and she was criticizing me. There was like some side criticisms about like, like I'm just um, a student of history because I'm just a PhD student. That's actually correct, right? I'm not an expert on the Holocaust. So if she, I certainly would say I'm competent, but I'm not an expert and I'm not a historian. I will be a historian, inshallah, but I'm not right now. But her main point was not about me. It was about like the act of platforming and debating Holocaust deniers, directly engaging them is just like that should be beyond the pale. And no, I didn't agree. I thought, um, if people are interested in something, people with some people with some claim to intellectualism and understanding of a subject should be engaging it, I think. I mean, who else is better suited, and if
This is, I mean, especially important for with Holocaust denial because there aren't a lot of. I mean, it's an important event. The establishment says that it happened a certain
hmm
way, but there are some myths about the Holocaust, uh,
hmm
and partly because it's difficult to correct the myth. If somebody makes something up,
hmm
then it sounds bad to say that it's wrong because then it sounds like you're denying the Holocaust. Uh, and so I think, okay, people can be sensitive about how they have the debate, but they're um, having open discussion is uh, the best solution to prevent Holocaust denial because
I
people who have
agree. I agree with you.
uh,
And I think most of these people, look, confirmation bias is very powerful with human beings, right? It's powerful with you and me, even though we'd like to think of ourselves as intellectuals, as cringe as that sounds. But it works. We have it too. Every human being has it. When you're talking about Holocaust deniers, it's going to be even worse because they're like in a cult. But nevertheless, there's some percentage of them that you can reach over time. I have the emails to prove it. Like, and if they're just in an echo chamber, they're never going to hear the other side of it. They're never going to hear that positive evidence. So I just don't really see the harm in engaging these people, as long as you're not like losing people you're not so incompetent that you're like losing people who believe in the Holocaust to denial, which I'm not doing. Um, then I just don't see the harm in it. But there's this taboo about engaging them at all in history, right?
well, in the case of MacDonald, if there had been open discussion of his ideas in the
hmm
1990s, I think this could have been resolved in a much better
And
way.
maybe he wouldn't have doubled down and tripled down and become like professional anti-Semite. I mean, maybe he could have been. Now he has so much. He's so pot committed that with human selfishness and ego, it'd be very difficult for him to say this is
No, it's
wrong.
totally impossible for him to change his mind about any of this stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
even when he just makes an outright mistake, he he won't admit it. Uh, just attributing fake quotes to people.
Yeah.
Um, I pointed out that he attributed a completely fake quote to Karl Marx about
hmm
Karl Marx saying that Jews will continue to exist in socialism as a distinct people or something, which is, of course, the opposite of what Marx thought.
Right. Right.
Uh,
I mean, like
and
his writings in the Jewish question, he believes that with the demise of capitalism comes the demise of Jewish identity.
he
Right.
said Jews are going to end
Right.
when
Yeah.
we get rid of the
He's
possibility of
anti-Jewish.
huckstering.
He's anti. Not in some biological sense, but like he thinks he's anti-Jewish, right?
So I mean, this is just an example. Even there, when it's just you got everything wrong, it's the opposite of the truth. McDonald did admit that the quotation didn't appear on the particular page that he claimed, but he was still never really admitted that it was wrong, and he was trying to weasel out of it. And then he published an article on his website where somebody was just outright defending the quote. But with no one has been able to point to the source of the fake quote because, of course, Marx never said it. But that's just an example of how
Mm,
when McDonald is now, I think, almost 80 years old. He's been
yeah.
doing this for a long time. So obviously, any kind of rational discussion with him is over.
Right.
Uh, and with Holocaust denial, uh, you know the history of Holocaust denial much better than I do. But um, whenever it is that it became taboo to have discussions about this and people were allowed to and certain myths were allowed to circulate without being challenged. Uh, then over time, this drove the Holocaust to the certain skeptical discussion of the Holocaust underground, and then
Yeah, they're in
becoming
echo chambers, and they're never going to hear the other side because people who are also people don't like enjoy, contrary to what we might fantasize about as liberal, I mean, not liberal in the sense of Democrats, obviously, but like enlightenment, people who believe in enlightenment and these kind of things. People don't like to see contrary views. So that's another good thing about debates and exchanges because people that's one way that they will look because if they see, oh, my guy is going to be KMAC's going to be arguing, then they might read you. They wouldn't read you if it would just like, I'm not going to engage KMAC, he's evil, but here's my, you know what I mean? Um,
and I think there is uh, an issue that should be discussed, which is Jews are overrepresented in certain activities, and
mhm.
there could be implications of that. And presumably, Jewish behavior is in some ways influenced by their Jewish background.
Mhm.
So,
I mean,
um,
that would be silly to assume it isn't.
so I would like to have a rational discussion
Right.
about how that works and what the implications are, and there could also be a discussion about whether it's good or bad, or what ways it's good or bad. So I was hoping to stimulate this um, a discussion like that. Um, Now there has been a lot of discussion, but not always as productive as I would have hoped.
Yeah. I'm sorry, just 1 second, Nathan. Okay. Yeah, just never mind. Just a text. Um, One question I have, so is it true that you backed out of some debate with like Mike Enoch or I mean I'm getting into pretty frivolous stuff today. I guess I'm in a dramatic mood. Uh, is it true that you backed out of a debate with Mike Enoch or Eric Stryker on these questions? You, no, it isn't.
No,
Would you actually debate them on
no, I said. Well, I said so. First, there's
it? A Cambridge fellow debating Eric Stryker. It's just a humorous concept, but yeah.
there's a popular myth that I refuse to
Hmm.
debate Kevin MacDonald, which is the opposite of the truth. I've
Hmm.
always said that I'm willing to debate MacDonald. I'll debate him on any platform he likes.
Hmm.
He says he refuses to debate me, uh, which is fine. That's his right. But
Hmm.
his followers should stop blaming me for being a coward for not debating MacDonald,
Yeah, they like
because
that.
he's the one who doesn't want to debate me. Now, about uh, Enoch and Stryker. So Enoch said he wanted to debate my paper, but he wasn't going to read it.
Hmm.
So, um, yeah, that's
What?
obviously
That's no,
that's a
that's
waste of
bad.
time. He
Yeah,
said
I've
he
had I've had so many. So I'm going to debate the guy on Holocaust now on the 17th. There's like I'd have to be killed. Someone would have to come in and murder me for me not to do it. But I've had to have there have been so many fucking bad faith attempts by him to avoid the discussion. And I will say this, none of the three people I debated previously on Holocaust now, none of them behaved like this. Mike, like not, now he was saying, let's just debate the documents you submitted, not the Holocaust. He said that recently. I said, no, we're gonna debate Holocaust. Like is the evidentiary basis for the Holocaust. We're not just gonna focus on some problem you see with one document, which probably isn't there at all, but of course, but
so yeah. This exchange with Enoch and Stryker. Then Stryker called me a Jew rat, and then I just stopped. You know, I I've learned that I don't know, for some reason it took me a while to learn this, but
hmm.
engaging with certain people is just a waste of time. And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it could be that uh, you know, theoretically they have a large audience, but the audience isn't the audience listens to them because they don't care about arguments or evidence, and they
I agree
they
with you,
find them.
but there are people. I think there is a one. 2%, 3% that can be deprogrammed. And I have literally people who are, there's one person I talked to just the other day, and there is another person who DM'd me several months back that are former TRS subscribers who have been persuaded by me on Holocaust denial. So that's two people already with very little reach on my part. So anecdotally, it strikes me as encouraging. Look, as I said earlier, confirmation bias is very powerful, especially when you're in a cult. But I think reason can, for some minority, triumph over time. Over time, because you know, what do you think about this? Just generally, what do you think about the role of reason versus emotions in human interaction? Because when I notice, even with intellectuals, when I see intellectuals debating in real time, you'll never see them concede a point to the other. Very rarely, at least. That strikes me as like, we're just so emotional and egotistic, and confirmation bias is everything. But maybe over time, once.
I should say about that. Uh, I mean, we need to have a certain amount of conservatism built into our beliefs,
Hmm.
because our beliefs form a kind of coherent web.
Mm,
And just because somebody seems to challenge one component of the web
mm,
doesn't mean that we should suddenly abandon everything we believe.
mm.
I mean, that's not a ration.
It's not
That's not a
pragmatic
more
either.
rational process, right? Uh, so you expect the changing of your mind to be more of a process that takes place over time, and you notice that this doesn't make much sense, and then this also doesn't make much sense, and well, what is a better way uh, of interpreting the evidence? So uh, so I don't think we should necessarily expect people to change their mind about, especially about fundamental issues, kind of um, on a whim or just in response to some apparently
Contradictory piece
strong
of data.
strong
Yeah.
evidence.
Yeah.
Uh, but that doesn't mean people belief formation is a rational process.
Mm,
I mean, obviously, emotions play an enormous role,
hmm.
um, and just if we had the ability to just um, acquire beliefs completely rationally, that might not actually be a good strategy in terms of promoting our own goals. I mean, people adopt the beliefs of the group that they're a part of. So
Hmm.
holding a belief is kind of a social activity. I'm part of the group that believes in Holocaust denial, or the group
Hmm.
that believes the Holocaust did happen. Uh,
Hmm.
so uh, certainly, for many people in these circles, the Holocaust denial circles, the
It's part of
anti
it's part of the framework that for them makes sense of the world, right? It's part of this.
it makes sense of the world, and it's also a social
Yeah,
activity.
right.
Like
It
a
is.
lot of many people are quite alienated,
Mm-hmm.
uh, especially like Mike Enoch's
Mm-hmm.
uh, followers they have some emotional issues, uh, and just giving them evidence for those people, the 98% that
Mm-hmm.
you referred to, uh, as long as these beliefs serve a certain emotional need, then it
Mm-hmm.
will be essentially impossible for them
Yeah.
to
And then
change.
for when you talk about the leaders, I mean, they're unemployable in mainstream society. They have a stable source of income and social standing in this like Jew theorist group. I mean, it just, if you look at human selfishness and you actually try to put yourself in their shoes, of course you'd hope you'd behave more moral than they are. But it would be very difficult to, even if you were convinced the Holocaust happened. I mean, because essentially admitting that for them is something a pauper at this point.
The only thing, so sometimes these people uh, can make a new living as a reformed
By the way, I'm going to talk to
person.
one of these people on Sunday, who is not. So I have a big problem with some of these people, like Christian Piccolini. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
Okay, he basically he's ex neo-Nazi, now is really woke. And my problem with him is he seems to be framing. I think he's actually undermining the cause of de-radicalization and fighting race hatred, because he has this false dichotomy where, okay, you're either a neo-Nazi or you're woke. So if you leave neo-Nazi and you become, let's say, like a conservative, um, and you're like, yeah, I'm against race hatred, but I'm not for DEI or affirmative action either. I'm like a Trump voter or whatever, or DeSantis, or but that is still neo-Nazi. That's what Piccolini would say. And so I have a big problem with that. And the guy I'm going to talk to on Sunday, Jeff Shoup, is carving out a third way where no, you can reject race hatred, and you can reject Jew theories and neo-Nazi without becoming woke or without becoming anti-white. You know what I mean? So that's one reason I'm interested in engaging with Jeff, because I think most of the de-radicalization people are not productive, frankly. Like they're actually hurting the cause of de-radicalization because they're like, you have to become woke and pretend to believe ideas that don't make any sense in order to leave like race hatred and Nazism. You get what I
Well,
mean?
if um, the anti-Semitism or that kind of thing was serving a an emotional purpose for you, and you haven't
Hmm.
dealt with the emotional issue that attracted you to that kind of form of extremism, then you would just look for a substitute uh,
Right.
ideology. And there are a lot
Mhm.
of similarities between the far right and
I agree with you.
anti-Semitic far right and the woke
I
left.
agree with you.
And then if academia was more open to exploring this kind of politically
Hmm.
incorrect issue, they would look at some of the personality similarities. Uh, Clearly,
Hmm.
people who uh, are looking for an outlet for to express hostility, looking
Hmm.
for um, looking for somebody to blame
Hmm.
for the world's problems. It's either
Hundred
Jews or
percent,
whites.
100% agree with you. And yeah, I completely agree with this. And the sad thing is that so basically, what I interpret this is these people, these woke academics who are blaming white people for everything, are essentially using these wonderful norms we've created in the West of opposing racism and opposing hatred. They're using it to excuse it at the same time because they have some theoretical framework that doesn't make any sense about how it's not really racism if it's whites. Now, of course, because of power structures, now, of course, it's inconsistent. So, like, nobody would say that like it's impossible to be racist to Japanese people in Japan because there's a much more real power structure favoring Japanese. Um, like they take passports from these workers from the Philippines till they're basically indenture them until their term of contracts are over, right? But nobody would say because of this power structure, it's impossible to be racist to Japanese. So they basically come up with really weak sham arguments to justify kind of mean-spirited, nasty, xenophobic attitudes to white people. That's how I see it. So it's like it's this attempt to appropriate the liberal tradition to justify just like old school xenophobia and dislike of the other. But it doesn't. But what's weird about it is a lot of these huge number of these people are white, so that's also strange. But yeah,
So, do people in the chat have any
yeah. Let's take a
comments?
look. Gosh, we have a lot. Um, wow, so many comments, guys. I wish I were more competent but I've been streaming. Um, let's see, Nathan. If you see one, you can. History Speak literally does not do math. Let's talk about LGBTQ now. People are funny. Um, yeah, uh, Mossad. Got a lot of people. I mean, that's very encouraging. Um, History Speaks is literally making me explain MacDonald's cure pointed worldview. Such a bad presenter. Let's see. I don't see many questions. There's a lot of engaging comments, but I don't see questions. I think next time I could probably get super chats to work. There's enough of you people that are interested. I really appreciate all you guys coming, including critics. Like, um, they're all talking about race realism, but like no one's asking a question. Someone ask a question.
I'm
Please.
becoming dark. I can't turn on the light because the
Well, you
Zoom
mean
flickers when I turn on the light. So I'm relying on the sun, which is going down.
it's just his natural skin color. He's not white. He's Jewish. So be a little more respectful, please. Masad wants to join for 5 minutes. I don't think so. Maybe next time. I'm gonna be running pretty soon. I'm not gonna read all your comments, Meat Machine. Ask a question. I'll read it. Okay. Lawyer asked a question. Uber is always reiterating it. What is your? This is for you. What is for you, Nathan? What is your opinion on group selection and ethnic genetic interests? Okay, you have the
So
floor, Nathan.
I think the dogma that group selection is impossible um, is unsupported. You can look at um, uh, Elliot Sober and D.S. Wilson have written about this. Uh, it's just so in the early to mid 20th century, some evolutionary theorists made naive appeals to group selection or the good of the species in order to explain the evolution of certain traits. And this was a mistake, but then we went too far in the other direction, saying group selection can never happen. Now, group selection is especially important in our species where we can enforce behavior uh, through cultural means, through punishment and uh, mechanisms like that. So, uh, culturally, uh, you can enforce certain behavior pattern within a group that then competes against other groups and could potentially survive and then proliferate as a result of that. And then through a process of gene culture coevolution, you can, those originally cultural traits can then become incorporated into genetically incorporated. So uh, I think group selection is clearly an important phenomenon in human evolution. Uh, Ethnocentrism under the right. So ethnocentrism is, I think, a much more complicated concept than people seem to assume. I think there are multiple people assume that it means just something like identifying with your racial group, uh, but it could also mean identifying with the people who you happen to live with or people you're familiar with, develop identifying with people who share an ideology or some other characteristics. Um, any to the extent that we have an any kind of innate impulse to identify with a racial group, I don't think it's that strong unless it's uh, cultivated by cultural means. But it's definitely something that I think should receive more attention, and there should be an effort to clarify what ethnocentrism means.
Do you know? Would you be able to reconstruct and give your view on Richard Dawkins's view of group select? Because Dawkins does not say race is like a taxonomically meaningless category, so he's not in that group. But he seems to be very skeptical of group selection.
Well, so on certain assumptions, group selection will almost always be swamped by selection within groups. So the selfish individual within a group beats altruists within the group, even though the more altruist, if a group of altruists will beat a group of selfish individuals because there's more cooperation, so they can be stronger together. But if you have one selfish individual among the altruists, then he will tend to win over the other altruists in the group, and then eventually the group becomes selfish, and even though that group, the altruists are better than the selfish group, still selfishness wins. So, but there are conditions under which group selection can be strong enough to counteract the effect of within group selection. And as I mentioned, when you consider the fact that culturally, so you can have cultural group selection, where, let's say, we have a mechanism to punish cheaters, to force everybody to cooperate. And now our group competes against other groups that don't have such a mechanism. Now we can win every time, and we can prevent the selfish person from getting the upper hand. And so that the evolutionary dynamics are especially different for our species.
Okay, Nathan, I'm going to see if there's any other questions. Mossad. Okay, I'll ask this. This is a pretty simple one. Actually, no, there's Lucian. Let's go, Lucian. Question for Cofnas. Thoughts on religiosity amongst Jews as another reason why Jews are overrepresented in liberal activism. And Lucian points out that in his view, in his observation, you do not see religious Jews engaged in this stuff.
Well, Jews who actually care about Jewish interests, so religious Jews and expats in Israel, they are not involved in any of these movements. They vote Republican. They're basically right-wing extremists. So that's a very strange pattern of behavior. If you buy into the MacDonald theory that liberalism is a strategy to advance Jewish interests, and yet all the Jews that actually care, that we have real evidence that they care about Jewish interests, they reject these movements. That doesn't seem to be consistent with what he's saying.
Right, agreed. Okay, I'm going to ask Chuav's question. Nathan, are you a compatible? This is actually, I'm interested in hearing your view on this. This is one of the views one of the questions I was very interested in as an undergrad. Nathan, are you a compatibilist or a determinist?
Well, those aren't the only options.
Yeah, or you could be a libertarian. Yeah.
So you're talking about the free will.
Yeah, free will.
Or
libertarian or whatever. Yeah.
So this is the
you're getting even darker, Nathan. Come on. Okay.
Either you have a deterministic universe. So given the conditions at time t1, then and the state of the world at time t2 is determined. The other option seems to be that it's not determined, and that would mean it's random. You can't know, you don't know what happens at time t2 because there's some random process involved. Either way, it's not, you don't get free will. Uh, and free will is supposed to mean we somehow, we determined what we
Mhm.
did.
We're the author, like,
And
I mean,
what does that,
go ahead.
mean? Another way of thinking about it is, how would you create, let's say you're God and you're creating people. How would you create a being with free will? Well, you can either make a deterministic world where however the agent act, however the being acts, is determined by its physiology and the environment, interacting with the environment, and that doesn't sound like free will. Or make it random, and then how is that free will? So I think the concept of free will is just confused. Once you put it under the microscope, it just it turns out to be incoherent.
Fully agree with you on that. One follow-up I'd have is, do you think compatibilism, it seems to me like a semantical game, um,
Yeah,
almost
it's
more
just a
than a
word.
substantive
It's just
argument. Yeah,
how do you define
right.
free will? Who cares? I
Yeah,
would, okay, maybe we care a little bit. We can, but the point is the naive uh, concept of free will that just
it's
we,
incoherent, you know.
no, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, because we don't like, I mean, you can even if you reflect without any kind of long exposition, I mean, we um we don't author our desires, right? We don't author our desires. We don't author our moral intuitions. We don't author our selfish desires. And and we also don't author whatever mechanism makes a determination between what we prefer at a given moment. So, I mean, if you look back, it's genetics and environment and so on. So yeah, I agree with you. I found it completely incoherent, and I got irritated by compatibilists like that because I thought they were playing a word game. That was an undergraduate. We're gonna do a couple more questions. Um, Politicast has a meaty one. Question: does Nathan think game theory or multi-agent systems are appropriate modeling methods for large-scale models where there may be millions of agents and data points? So I don't understand that, but I'm happy to read it to you, Nathan, and hand it off to you.
Oh, so regarding the role of models in cultural evolution, I have a paper on that. Although I warn you, it's a bit um, it's a bit dense compared to some of my other papers. It's in the Quarterly Review of Biology, called "Power in Cultural Evolution and the Spread of Pro-Social Norms." Uh, People like using these models because people like technical methods, because that's makes everything work out nice, and you can. But at least when it comes to history and uh, also the evolution of morality, I think uh, a lot of these models can't be applied because the models are very good when you have, you know, a phenomenon that behaves according to regular predictable patterns. But when you have um, when the process is determined by random events or the whims of uh, powerful individuals, um, then the models become much less useful. So if you're interested in the details of that, you might take a look at the paper.
Okay, we're last question. Um, Maybe Luke Croft. Um, why did the far right, alt-right, become so stupid? That's an interesting question. Maybe you have a theory on that.
Well, I I tweeted about this a few days ago. Um, so conservatism and right wing movements in general tend to become stupid. Uh, there, I think, are several reasons. One, why mainstream conservatism is stupid, and this is something that we disagree with, is I think leftism and wokeism are largely the logical consequence of the equality thesis. And so most smart, so conservatives generally accept the equality, the premise that gives rise to wokeism, but then they deny its logical conclusions. And I'm not saying there can't be smart people who do that, or there can't be smart
Just state
arguments
your
for that.
position, Nathan. We're having
But
you on here to state your views. So
but
go ahead.
okay, I won't be too try to be overly agreeable. I think smart people are going to be disproportionately drawn to wokeism if those are the given those two options. Now, when you start an alternative movement that does acknowledge uh, race differences, as the alt right did, first you get a lot of you get attention uh, from smart people who are looking for a political alternative that is rooted in what they see as the reality of race differences. You also get a lot of people with nothing to lose, people who are just very disagreeable and kind of against the world in general and just want to make trouble. Uh, you need mechanisms to filter out the people who are not going to be helpful to the movement if the movement is going to be successful, and to prevent them from being elevated into leadership positions. And the alt right never uh, was never focused on that. Just anybody who could get attention. This all happens in other right wing circles, other conservative circles as well. So status is entirely determined by your ability to generate attention, and not really by the quality of the attention or the quality of your thoughts or your plans. So that's why right wing leaders in general are much more often grifters than their leftist counterparts. Of course, you have grifters on the left too, but I mean, just the landscape on the right is dominated by grifters. And of course, the leaders of the alt right were um, emphasized the Jewish stuff as uh,
The
a
linchpin.
very important element of alt right ideology, which was a wrong theory, which well, the wrong theory, which gives rise to further stupidity, uh, which attracts people who a mixed bag, and yes, and then it spirals out of control as it did.
Yeah, so I'm just going to push back a little bit on your first answer, Nathan. I think quite naturally. So yeah, just to reiterate something I said earlier, I don't accept the premise that um, because something is environmental, that therefore we can change it and should change it in terms of transforming the culture. So if it is environmental, um, we don't know how to change it. Many environmental differences between groups are incorrigible, right? Or we don't know how to change them with social policy. So I don't think it follows that we have to have some woke Manhattan project and deprecate meritocracy and have less competent people. So I would push back on that. One point I'd add, and I don't know if you agree with this, is this isn't uh, critiquing what you said; it's just adding on to it. Is I tweeted the other day about how I think the conservative movement has too many lawyers. and not enough philosophers, um, um, uh, uh, artists, novelists, historians among its intelligentsia. I just think there's oversaturation of lawyers among intellectuals on the right. Do you think that's a problem, or no?
Well, uh, I thought we have a problem in conservatism that we have few intellectuals, few philosophers or philosophically minded people to think through ideas. Um, and then I myself became a conservative philosopher, and I discovered it's not that there are no people like this, but there's no market for people like this in the conservative
It's really
world.
interesting.
So uh, I am just based on my academic papers. I mean, I've probably like the third most well-known millennial philosopher, or the third most widely read millennial philosopher in terms of my papers, which have academic papers in total about 400,000 downloads,
I can
far
believe that
more.
because I can't think on the top of my head of any other
Well, there's
millennial
Will
philosopher.
McCaskill, I would say, would be one. Kate Mann, probably two.
Okay.
Uh, but in terms of papers, I'm definitely number one. My articles often do very well, just in terms of clicks and generating discussion, but I can't publish in legacy conservative uh,
Hmm.
outlets. They don't care what I have to say. As my stuff gets rejected just based on the title.
Hmm.
If I say, "Are you interested in this?" They'll just say, "Yeah, no, we don't care what you have to say."
Hmm.
And so what they do, they publish an endless stream of articles on the same ideas about Chuck Schumer's a hypocrite, and
Yeah.
the Democrats are groomers.
Elizabeth Warren's not really a 32nd Native American. I mean, it's like, yeah, you know.
So why uh, they just don't want to hear
Hmm.
from somebody like me, because the idea of challenging their audience in any way is not something that they're interested in. The idea of entertaining subtlety or ideas that go beyond the very basic ideas that they're familiar with, they're just yeah, that's not part of the conservative
Yeah,
movement.
I think that's a serious problem. I think for the right, that they really are hostile to intellectual life. I think, in the way the left isn't. As absurd as we may consider many premises the left has, there is like more of a respect for intellectuals on the left than the right. I think the right is very much drunk on populism right now.
Yeah, but there were supposed to be a small number of intellectual
Hmm.
conservative outlets, but it's largely fake
Yeah,
intellectualism.
I agree with that. All right, we're gonna get one more question, and then I gotta go work out. Um, one more question from M. So what? Nathan showing his bias. We got a lot of critics, Nathan. I think I got more than you. What the fuck? Guys, ask a question. Like, I mean, your comments are great, but ask a question.
Who says I'm showing my bias?
I just read some comment on the screen. I don't know if it was glib or I mean the guy also said philosophy is cringe. So I mean, it's oh, the
I'm
Mossad
curious.
said that.
What is my
The Mossad
bias?
said that. Yeah, Mossad, what is his bias? Let's get a little back and forth. All right, maybe he checked out. I mean, he's busy. He's the Mossad, so all right, we're gonna have Luke Croft comments. I'm gonna just read a few comments actually. Luke Croft comments: the conservative movement has too many grifters. Mossad comments: philosophy is cringe. um, who Politicos says link to papers, please. I can put them in the show notes afterwards. I think we'll
Everything
wrap.
is on my
Um,
website,
yeah,
nathancofnas.com.
we got quite. I'm actually very pleased with how many people came in. Wow, 110 live, not bad for the first one. You were my experiment, Nathan. All right, so I'll get you back on screen. I really appreciate you talking, and we'll talk more. I'll probe you on Twitter DMs for maybe more information about your writings and your worldview. But I appreciate you coming on and showing patience with me and getting the thing set up. So, and I appreciate everybody who tuned in to criticize me or Nathan. And we're going to do an interview on History Speaks on Sunday with Jeff Shoup, so former neo-Nazi guy. Woke. So, Nathan, thank you very much. Guys, I'll see you soon. Good job. All right. I'll just get off iStream. Oh, interesting.